this land was Mexico. This was a state, or rather a region, a territory known as Alta California. And the people who resided within this area were known as the Californios. Now the Californios had a very strong regional identity. They called themselves gente de razón and Mexicanos de la otra banda, Mexicans of a different branch of the Mexican nation. Now, so often historians have typically spoken of that as distinct to the Californios, that only the Californios had a regional identity and only them had the pomp and circumstance to call themselves independent. Now that is not true. As a historian, it is important to understand that throughout Mexico, indigenous peoples as well as Hispanic peoples constantly tried to assert independence from the Mexican center. They did not always believe in the federal government of Mexico. They did not always believe that Mexico City would have the backs of the regional districts like Alta California. And so often that led to periods of civil war. It led to periods of conflict. It led to internal conflicts in California too, even battles between Northern California and Southern California. I don't think we have that today anymore, but in that time period, we had the norteños and sureños that would constantly fight over who should be in charge of deciding California's future. In the 1830s, we start to have the beginnings of young men who were sons or grandsons of the first pobladores, the first Spanish settlers to come into this area and establish the missions, the presidios, and pueblos. Now these young descendants now start to grow of age. People like Pio Pico or Andres Pico. And these young men are part of this new era of politics that want to assert their right to control California and do with it what they want to. And part of that too is removing any form of colonial oppression, including mission oppression, and removing the land from the missions in what is called secularization. So removing all control from the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was still seen as a remnant of the colonial days of the Spanish Empire. Now the question is, why am I talking to you about Spain when we're here to talk about the Civil War? Well, let me tell you, that plays actually a very important role in the story that happened here in Southern California in 1860. If we flash forward in time, we're in the 1840s. Between 1846 and 1848, we have a huge major conflict to gain hold of a large, substantial territory, which is known as Northern Mexico. Northern Mexico also incorporates Alta California, and the United States is trying to get hold of it. By 1848, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this now becomes part of the United States. But these same people that years prior had tried and had internal conflict even with each other over who will have the destiny of control over California, while those people are still living here. Those people still want to assert control over California. Pio Pico being one of them, the last Mexican governor of California. But now California is in new hands. To a certain extent, the process goes easy. This becomes part of the United States. It becomes a state in 1850, and everybody who lives here, all the Mexicans, are allowed to become part of the United States. That is granted under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that you are citizens. And you men have the right to vote in our democracy and participate in our democracy and become Americans. However, that process was even constantly challenged, because around the same time, we have land speculation, where all these Mexicans, these Hispanics living in this area, start to have their land challenged, right? Their rights, their claim to their ranchos, whether it's Rancho Las Bolsas right here in Huntington Beach, or Rancho Los Cerritos in Long Beach, where I'm from. But those lands start to come in question, and many of these men and women who hold these land titles start to lose them. Additionally to that, in 1855, we have a new law that is known as the Greaser Act, which essentially starts the criminalization and marginalization of Mexican Americans in California in that particular time, as well as indigenous peoples. Yes, 1855, yeah. And that was something that was sponsored by Senator Goodwin. And as we move forward in time, So we start to have the loss of land. We start to have people being criminalized simply because of their color of their skin, and they can be jailed simply because of what they look like, seen as a suspicious character. So now the right to California is only so much more contested. Now, prominent men like Andres Pico saw the alliance with the chivalry faction of the Democratic Party as something that was really important. Now, if you don't know about politics in that time period, that's okay. But in short, the chivalry faction of the Democratic Party was the slave-supporting faction of the Democratic Party. They were the ones that wanted to uphold slavery and, more importantly, the expansion of slavery. Now, the question is, why would then Hispanics want to support these people? Now, there was a large percentage, and the reason why is because the chivalry faction of the Democratic Party had a huge rule over the state of California in that particular time period. California was a predominantly Democratic state during that time period, Democrat-ruled state. Not like today, don't get that concept. There are different types of parties, different political system that we have today. So pull that away. This is over 150 years ago. And at that time period, these Democrats did believe in the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, even though California outlawed slavery and the Mexican nation also outlawed slavery. But the reason why these Californios were drawn to supporting the Democrats in that time period is because if they were the ruling party, right, in California politics, then being allies with them was a way to regain control of California, a California that they felt they were constantly losing every day. Because what else happens in 1848? The gold rush, the California gold rush, and immigrants from all over the world, not just here in the United States, not just migrants from the US, but immigrants from all over the world are coming to California for that gold. By 1850, California is the 5th largest economy in the world because of all the industry that arises from the gold. So it's not even just the gold solid bricks. It's also all the industry, all the commerce, all the business that arises from that is also boosting the California economy. Now, with that said, you have an increased population, you have these people, the Hispanics that are losing their land, they are being criminalized and marginalized, and they are trying to hold on to anything. And having an allyship, being allies with the Democratic Party, was one of those ways of doing it. However, this started to be very concerning once we move into the election of 1860. It starts to become very, very much concerning because in 1859, just 1 year prior, there had been an attempt to split California in half, led by an effort of Andres Pico and the chivalry faction of the Democratic Party, split California in half, assume the southern portion as the territory of Colorado with the potential of making that a whole new state and also making it a slave state. And that was very concerning to the growing Republican Party and very concerning to military officials. So by the time we go into 1860, and we are about to get to this conflict, the American Civil War, military officials are looking at the Californians, they're looking at the Hispanics, because even though they have been overshadowed by a huge population in Southern California, there's still a majority Latino, there's still a majority Hispanic. Up until the 1880s, the primary language of this region that we are on was Spanish. So 40 years, it took 40 years before the primary language became English here on this land that we're standing in. The primary language was Spanish. And so the military officials that were here were really concerned once war broke out that the civilian population in the area was going to rebel. Because already there had been talks of secession amongst Californio peoples as well as amongst chivalry Democrats. And the combination of the two seemed deadly. Now in Los Angeles, in the Pueblo de Los Angeles, which is one of the most prominent pueblos in this area at the time period, there was actually an uprising. It's known as the El Monte Uprising or the El Monte Revolt, in which men actually paraded on the street, shouting, "Hurrah for Jefferson Davis, hurrah for the South, hurrah for the South." Also in newspapers, in the Los Angeles Star, which is kind of the precursor to the Los Angeles Times, when Lincoln won, it was said, whatever disaster might have happened in the rest of this country, here our glorious banner flutters in victory. And it's not the banner of the United States. It's the banner of the Confederacy. So already it seemed like revolt was going to happen. And we only had one poor dude, one little dude here to defend all of Orange County and Los Angeles. Does anybody know who that guy is? I don't know if I heard that. What did you say? Okay. Winfield Scott Hancock, who would go on to become a famed general of the American Civil War. But Winfield Scott Hancock in that time period was a quartermaster for the U.S. Army and was stationed in Los Angeles on a small little 2-room adobe on Alameda Street in downtown LA. That's all he had. He had a bunch of ammunition and he lived with his wife. And he was really concerned that he and his wife Ada were going to have some of those people who were revolting attack their adobe, take all of those weapons, and start a revolt of Los Angeles. And then eventually spread to the whole of Southern California. Now, why is that concerning? Well, if we talk about the Confederacy, right, for so long, history has been a conversation about the Civil War between the eastern edge of the, out in the Atlantic, all the way to the west, which is Tennessee, right? But that's not the Civil War. The Civil War is a lot bigger than that. And that's what historians are trying to say today. That's what my scholarship has tried to do, is expand the scale of the American Civil War. And in doing that, we not only understand the important role of slavery in the American Civil War, but we also understand the importance of California's economy to the Civil War. What is coming from the north on trade ships down south to Latin America, around the Horn, and up to New York? Does anybody know what's coming from those ships? No? Gold. Gold. California's economy paid for 25% of the American Civil War. So be proud of that, Californians. Hurrah! Yes, hurrah, be proud of that. You paid for 25% of the American Civil War. And that is with California's gold economy. And as that gold is making its way down the Pacific, if this southern district became part of the Confederacy, it gives the Confederacy access to Pacific ports and the potential to launch a Confederate Navy. And that was very, very concerning to Union officials at the time. So in 1861, under the command of General Sumner, it was demanded that the dragoons up at Fort Tejon, which is a state park here in California, if you've never been there, go check it out. The dragoons were ordered down to Los Angeles and were ordered to occupy that town. Eventually that group would expand, more troops were ordered from San Francisco, and the amount of military men would constantly grow, eventually needing the demand for a larger military base known as the Drum Barracks. The Drum Barracks still survives today. They have a really cool booth out there. I think they're about to leave, but if you see it, go check it out. But it is still one of the last remaining Civil War sites in California and in Southern California specifically. And that military base was to serve as the headquarters for the U.S. Army in the Southern District. So that's navigating all operations from Santa Barbara all the way down to the Mexican border in Baja California, and then all the way out into the Arizona Territory. So that is a huge, vast amount of land that was headquartered here. This is where troops were trained. This is where troops were mobilized to. Good question, Wilmington. So it was put in Wilmington, California. Yeah, so New San Pedro is what it was known at the time. It's sandwiched between Long Beach and San Pedro today. So right in the port of Los Angeles. And military also played a role in the development of the port of LA, but that's a whole other story for another time. Now, so you have an increased amount of people coming here, military soldiers that are being trained, and they're being sent out into the West. They're being sent out into the West into the East for many reasons. One of them being to navigate the indigenous populations, because there were a lot of hostilities between the native groups as well as the oncoming settlers. We have this idea about manifest destiny, go west my son, and so people wanted to settle, but that often conflicted with the native populations who had lived there for 10,000 years. And of course that's gonna pose a problem. So the military was the one to assure that that process could still happen. while also too stopping the campaign from in 1862 under the command of General Sibley from the Confederacy out west. Stop that and push it back in Arizona. And Picacho Peak would be the closest they would get to us out near Tucson. That would be the closest any form of combat, of Civil War era combat would get to us here in Los Angeles or in the West. Now, all that's happening, all this military activity, and to a certain degree, it was able to quell or calm any form of hostilities in the area thereafter. So there was no uprising, there was no revolt as Union officials feared. Now, remember I said how Andres Pico wanted to split the state of California in half? Well, Andres Pico became one of the most ardent supporters of the Union. And here's why. Many of these men, predominantly men who were involved in politics at the time period, the women were as well, but it was the men who held the power. A lot of these Californio men, they saw the opportunity of having allies who were in power as a way to gain back authority over California, a California, like I said, that they felt that they were constantly losing. But at the same other end, there were also other Californios who said, we strongly disagree with your opinion. We strongly disagree that we should support the chivalry Democrats because they are the very ones who started the land speculation laws. They were the very ones that started criminalizing us and putting us in jails. So why should we support the Democrats? Why should we support them? And one of them was the activist Francisco Ramirez, who was also a local resident of this region. And Francisco said, it is disappointing to see that after so many insults and affronts, one still sees the Hispanics supporting the slavery party with their vote. And so he was calling out what people like Andres Pico had done. That how could they support these people that are racist against us? Why would you support them? But in the end, it was seen that it was an opportunity to gain hold of California. And supporting the Union was a way to uphold the democratic freedoms that the nation of Mexico, as well as the nation of the United States, had fought for so long. And so here is Andres Pico's reply, as well as his brother Pio Pico's reply, asking them, are they loyal to the Union? Andres Pico responded to Edward Fitzgerald Beale in the following way. I elected to become a member of the Confederation, adopting the citizenship of the same, of which I am proud, that although my political opinions as previously expressed have differed from those of the Republican Party, these considerations cease in the face of the attack made against the federal government, and unconditionally, and at all hazards, I am for the Union entire. To maintain which I would cheerfully offer as a soldier my sword, and as a citizen my fortune. His brother, who was a Republican, responded with this. My acts and my vote placed in the ballot box in favor of the worthy President of the United States are faithful testimonials of my political opinions. To these I have now to add that although I lament the disturbances occasioned by the southern states, I approve the energetic measures adopted by the government for the preservation at all costs of the Constitution and the Union entire. What we saw in that moment was a reshifting of the beliefs that other military officials and other non-Hispanics had thought of the Latino population. The Latino population firmly believed in the ideals of the United States because they too had fought for the liberal ideals of freedom for all, equality for all, and a promise to a right to land, a promise to a right to vote, and a constant progressive government that can continue to secure those freedoms in the future. The oppression created by the Confederacy and the southern states, and the oppression seen by Maximilian in Mexico at the time, and the Conservative Party of Mexico, were seen as remnants of colonial oppression and not the freedoms that the nations of Mexico and the nations of the United States had fought for. In response, what we see, especially between 1862 and 1865, is a mass mobilization of Mexican Americans in California and throughout the American Southwest to fight in favor for the Union. Here in California, we had the formation of a Native California Cavalry, the 1st Battalion of Native California Cavalry. They also have a booth over there, you should go check them out with Dennis. But we had a formation of a predominantly Latino cavalry unit of expert cavalrymen to go out into battle on the east. We also had men join other forms of military operations in the area. We had people like Ladislao, who actually also fought in Mexico, so men were also fighting in Mexico, and it's this really unique time where we have all this mobilization because people strongly believed in the ideals, the liberal ideals of, again, Mexico and the United States. Now, aside from fighting in militaries, whether the Mexican militaries or the United States military, we also had political activism happening during this time period. Most notably, juntas patrióticas, patriotic assemblies, which were these clubs gathering of men and women, as well as young members, coming together and raising funds for the war, whether the war effort here or the war back in Mexico. There was still this attachment to the Mexican homeland. So that also challenged beliefs about Californios being isolated and wanting to be their own people. It was clear, as Leonard Pitt, the historian, says, that in the heart of hearts of Californios, they were Mexican. And they had a love of the Mexican nation. They also had a love, of course, for California and for their right to assert control over their home state, over their homeland. During that time period, these juntas patrióticas, these patriotic assemblies, would gather to raise funds and hold patriotic rallies. They would display the banners of the United States and the banners of Mexico, tied together, physically tied together, with portraits of Lincoln, Washington, Morelos, and Juarez, all stringed together. The founding fathers and leaders of both nations string together in this solidarity about what freedom means, and that freedom is a shared idea between Mexicans and Americans, and that both can be true, and that the harmony of being a Mexican American can exist. In those particular rallies, too, there became a moment of celebration on a particular day. When the Battle of Puebla was won in May 5th of 1862 by Juarez against French forces, that battle of May 5th became known as El Cinco de Mayo, which we still celebrate here today in the United States, and is, as Hayes Bautista says, the historian, an American tradition, and more importantly, a Mexican-American tradition. The celebration of Cinco de Mayo has been celebrated here in this territory ever since. And it is still celebrated in the Pueblo de Los Angeles, where it originated, every single year. So go check it out, it's really cool. But they celebrate it. So that's Cahuenga. They celebrate it in the Pueblo Square, so near Aldera Street. So you should go check it out. But the celebration of Cinco de Mayo was for these Mexicans a way to assert themselves as, yes, I am still Mexican. Yes, I still dress differently than you Yankees. But that does not mean I am not an American. And that in simply being a Mexican, that I am different to you. I can be both Mexican and American. And it is the beginnings of that identity, the beginnings of being loyal to both nations and belonging to two places. Now, what we see in that too is that assertion of I belong, of challenging those ideas of not belonging, and that I am a citizen, and that I do fight for greater things. In total, there'd be over 10,000 Latino Americans that fought in the American Civil War in favor of the Union. That is an impressive number. Yeah, hurrah, 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 right? And that was not only men, it was women. And there's some pretty incredible stories about women there, including women spies who would dress up as soldiers from the other side of the Confederacy and pretend to be men and get inside or get information from the other side. Really, really incredible stories of bravery, of hardship, but of resilience, of trying to be a part of this country. Now, in the end, what we ended up seeing, particularly with the Native California Cavalry, is many of these men never went to go see much action, but their loyalty to the country and having hundreds of men, Mexican American, Latino men, because there was also Chilenos too, and there were El Salvadorians, so it's important to acknowledge them as well. But to have these Latino men band together, come together in that one moment to want to go fight is pretty remarkable, even though they didn't ever fully have the opportunity to do so. The act that they went and enlisted and formed these companies, because initially these companies took a while to form, they didn't form until 1863. And so it took a minute. And part of that had to do with military officials didn't trust them. They didn't trust these Latinos to participate in the US Army or to have their own cavalry units or even their own officers. They were entrusted to have that. But eventually, through the efforts of really important, prominent people like Andres Pico, like Salvador Vallejo, like Ramoldo Pacheco, the state senator, because we had these active political leaders pushing for change, the change happened. And they were able to have these men participate in one of the most important engagements of American history. So it's really, really remarkable, and I encourage you, I could only touch on so much of this story. It is such a vibrant story. There's so much history. There are so many historians who are starting to do the work of writing the history of the American Civil War in the West that is not only a history of the Mexican American people, it is a history of the indigenous peoples that live here. It is a history of the Chinese Americans that lived here. It is a history of so many different people that touch the American West, a really diverse region, and an incredible story, an incredible epic. So please, this is my last thing I'll say before I move into something special. Don't just stop at Tennessee. Please don't. Go further west. Go west, my son. Go west, my daughters, and learn more of the history of the Civil War out here. So, in the tradition, in the spirit of Cinco de Mayo, even though that's a while back ago, but in the spirit too of those brave Mexican Americans back in the day, we're going to end with a traditional grito. How many of you have done a grito before? The grito, the patriotic grito? Okay, very good. A grito was a typical, basically, kind of a call and response proclamation of independence that was done in political rallies since the birth of the Mexican nation in 1810. Since then, this has been a tradition that was started by Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla and still continues today. If you ever go to Mexico in September and you go for Independence Day, the president comes out from the presidential palace and gives his famous grito and rings a bell to accompany it. It's a proclamation of independence and freedom. And during the time of the American Civil War, here in the ranchos and in the pueblos, including the pueblo de Los Angeles, it was typical to incorporate not only in that call and response Mexican names of people who were important to the country, and of course the name of the Mexican nation, but people who were important to the American nation as well. So you're going to hear things like, "Que viva Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla," and then you guys will respond, "Que viva!" And then you're going to hear "Que viva el presidente Lincoln," and you guys are going to say "Viva!" Que viva! Yeah, you could say "Que viva" or "Viva." I like "Viva" because it's easier. So we'll just say "Viva." So we'll practice. "Que viva Mexico!" Viva! Okay, very good. So we're going to get started with that. Citizens, we gather here in a great time of difficulty, our darkest hour for this great nation which we call the United States of America. Mexicanos, hispanos, esto es nuestro país, nuestra Alta California. Mexicans, This is our land, our glorious Alta California. Proclaim it with joy, but keep hold and steady to the Union. The Union is our cause, for the Union is the freedoms for which our founding fathers, Miguel Hidalgo and George Washington, fought for. In the tradition and the spirit of our two nations, let us proclaim independence and freedom. ¡Que viva el pueblo de Los Ángeles! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva Rancho Las Bolsas! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva Rancho Los Cerritos! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva México! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva México! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva México! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva los Estados Unidos! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva los Estados Unidos! ¡Viva! ¡Que viva los Estados Unidos! ¡Viva! Very good. Good job. Give yourself a round of applause. And that's it.